On July 1, 2002, a father stood in a cemetery staring at 3 fresh graves: his wife, his son, his 4-year-old daughter. Days earlier, they boarded a plane for a family vacation. 71 people were on that flight, and not a single person survived. The man responsible was not a terrorist. He wasn't even on the plane. He was sitting in an office in Switzerland, and that night, he was the only one watching the sky. 2 years later, this father would track him down, knock on his front door, and hand him a folder of photographs. What happened in the next 90 seconds would make one man a corpse and the other a national hero. This is the story of Vitaly Kaloyev. Vitaly Kaloyev built things for a living. He was a successful architect in southern Russia, the kind of man who measured twice and trusted his own hands more than anyone else's. People who knew him described him as quiet, serious, and completely devoted to 3 people: his wife Svetlana, his son Konstantin, and his little daughter Diana. That summer, life was opening up. Vitaly had taken a contract in Spain, building a vacation home near Barcelona. The plan was simple. He would finish the project, and his family would fly out to join him for a holiday in the sun. On the night of July 1st, Svetlana and the children boarded Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937 from Moscow. They almost didn't make that plane. The flight was a charter, arranged at the last minute because a large group of schoolchildren had missed their scheduled flight to Spain days earlier. Most of the passengers in the cabin that night were kids, a school group headed for a beach holiday on the Spanish coast. The charter was supposed to be the lucky break that saved their summer. Vitaly drove to Barcelona airport to pick up his family, but they never arrived. To understand what happened to them that night, you need to visit the control room. 500 miles away, inside a Swiss air traffic control company called SkyGuide, a Danish controller named Peter Nielsen was starting the night shift. On paper, 2 controllers were supposed to be on duty. In reality, Nielsen's colleague was resting in another room. It was against the official rules, but it had become normal practice on quiet nights. Nielsen was alone, responsible for every aircraft crossing one of the busiest air corridors in Europe. And that night, the room was working against him. Maintenance crews were rebuilding the center's systems, so the main radar was running in a degraded backup mode. The automated alert that warns controllers about converging aircraft was not available to help him. Even the direct phone line to neighboring airports was down. Then it got worse. A delayed passenger jet needed guiding into a nearby airport, which forced Nielsen to split his attention between 2 workstations and 2 radio frequencies at once. One man, 2 screens, half-broken equipment, and dozens of lives moving through the dark at 500 miles an hour. At 36,000 feet above southern Germany, Flight 2937 was cruising through a clear night sky. And approaching from the opposite direction, at the exact same altitude, was a DHL cargo jet with 2 pilots on board. 2 aircraft, 1 collision course, and the only man watching had no idea. Here's the part almost nobody knows. In a control center in Karlsruhe, Germany, another controller saw the danger on his radar. He grabbed the phone and tried to warn SkyGuide. He dialed again and again, more than 10 times. The broken phone line never connected. With less than a minute to impact, Nielsen finally spotted the conflict. He keyed his radio and ordered Flight 2937 to descend. But at almost the same moment, inside the Russian cockpit, an automated voice started shouting. It was TCAS, the onboard collision avoidance system, and it commanded the exact opposite: climb. Now stop and put yourself in that cockpit. A machine in your cockpit screams climb. A human voice on the radio says descend. You have seconds to choose, and Russian pilots of that time were trained that the controller's word came first. They pushed the nose down. The DHL pilots, following their own TCAS, were descending too. At 11:35 p.m., the 2 aircraft collided in the darkness above the German town of Überlingen. The Tupolev was torn apart in the air. Wreckage and bodies rained down across more than 100 square miles of fields, forests, and gardens. 71 people were dead, every passenger and crew member on both planes, the school group, the 2 cargo pilots, and Svetlana, Konstantin, and Diana Kaloyeva. When the airline's passengers didn't arrive in Barcelona, Vitaly started making calls. Within hours, he was on his way to Germany, and he became one of the first family members to reach the crash site. He refused to wait behind the tape. He walked the debris field himself, searching. Imagine a father walking through burning wreckage, searching for pieces of his family. He was the one who found Diana, his 4-year-old daughter, lying in a cornfield, nearly 2 miles from the main wreckage. Her body was almost untouched. She looked like she was sleeping. Something in Vitaly broke that day and never repaired itself. Back home, he turned a room of his house into a shrine filled with their photographs, and he began spending his days at the cemetery, sometimes sleeping beside the graves he had built. Friends watched a strong, precise, rational man dissolve. He stopped working. He barely ate. He lived inside one question: how does this happen, and who answers for it? That second part is where the system failed him. The investigation moved slowly. Skyguide's early public statements pointed at the Russian pilots before the facts were in. To Vitaly, every press release felt cold and corporate, written by lawyers instead of human beings. Then came the offer. Skyguide proposed compensation of roughly 160,000 Swiss francs for his entire family, and according to Kaloyev, accepting it meant signing away the right to pursue the company further. 60,000 for his wife, 50,000 for each child. Vitaly didn't see compensation. He saw a price tag and a demand for his silence as part of the deal. He refused to sign. And that is the moment grief stopped being grief and became a mission. Now here's what makes this story so hard to sit with. While Vitaly was sleeping at a cemetery in Russia, the man he blamed was falling apart too. Peter Nielsen never returned to controlling aircraft. He was reportedly devastated by the disaster, haunted by those final seconds at the radar screen. He received hate mail and threats. He had a wife and 3 young children, and people close to him said he was struggling to carry the weight of that night. He was also, in the eyes of investigators, not the cause of the disaster so much as the last failure point in a chain of failures. The understaffed night shift, the disabled warning systems, the dead phone lines, none of that was one man's doing. But Vitaly Kaloyev was no longer thinking in chains of causes. In his mind, one man had been watching the sky when his family died, and that man had never once looked him in the eye and said the words, "I'm sorry." So Vitaly did what nobody expected from a grieving father. He hired a private detective, and the detective came back with a name, a street, and a house number in Kloten, Switzerland, a quiet suburb near Zurich Airport. On a cold February evening, almost 2 years after the crash, Vitaly Kaloyev walked up the path of a tidy Swiss family home. In his hands were photographs of Svetlana, Konstantin, and Diana. In his pocket was a folding knife. Peter Nielsen came outside. His wife and children were in the house behind him. Only one of the 2 men ever told the world what happened next. According to Kaloyev, he held out the photographs of his children and demanded an apology. And according to Kaloyev, Nielsen swatted the pictures out of his hand. Vitaly says everything after that moment is a blank. He claims he remembers nothing of what he did. What the evidence showed is this: Nielsen was stabbed multiple times and bled to death in his own garden, steps from his front door, while his family was home. The controller who survived the worst night in Swiss aviation history did not survive the grieving father it created. And now there was a second family destroyed. 3 more children who lost a parent to the same disaster, just 2 years later. Vitaly was arrested the next day. He didn't run far. Police found him calmly waiting at a nearby hotel. In 2005, a Swiss court convicted Vitaly Kaloyev of murder and sentenced him to 8 years. The story should end there, but it doesn't. On appeal, the court accepted that he had acted in a state of severely diminished responsibility, a mind crushed beyond normal limits by grief. His sentence was cut, and in November 2007, after less than 4 years behind bars, Vitaly Kaloyev walked free. When his plane landed back home in North Ossetia, he was met by cheering crowds. People greeted him with flowers. To many in his home region, he wasn't a murderer at all. He was a father who had done what the courts and the corporations refused to do, hold someone personally accountable. Less than a year later, the regional government made it official. Vitaly Kaloyev was appointed Deputy Minister of Construction. The man who killed Peter Nielsen now had a state job and a hero's reputation. And what about the people who actually ran that broken control room? In 2007, a Swiss court convicted 4 Skyguide managers over the disaster. Their punishment was suspended sentences and fines, which means that in the entire story of Überlingen, a catastrophe that killed 71 people, the only person who ever served real prison time was the grieving father. The collision changed aviation forever. Because the Russian pilots obeyed a human over the machine, the rules were rewritten worldwide. Today, every airline pilot on Earth is trained that when TCAS speaks, you follow it, no matter what the controller says. The lesson of that night is now built into every cockpit in the sky. Vitaly Kaloyev rebuilt a version of a life. He remarried, and in his late 50s he became a father again, to twins. But in every interview since, one thing has never changed. He has never expressed remorse for what he did in that garden, and he has said he does not consider himself a murderer. In Kloten, 3 children grew up without their father. In Vladikavkaz, an old man still visits 3 graves he built with his own hands. Revenge gave Vitaly Kaloyev everything except the only thing he wanted. So here's the question this story leaves behind, and be honest with yourself before you answer. If everything you loved was erased in a single night, and the world handed you a price tag instead of an apology, are you sure you would have done any differently?